Now, welcome again anyone who is just now joining. Today's webinar, Priority in the Street, How Lviv Transformed Its City One Sustainable Mode at a Time, will be presented by Orest Oleksiv, who is the head of the Transport Department for the City of Lviv. We'll hear lessons learned from the city's leadership, actions, and public processes that together contributed to a story of a decade-long transformation of its public spaces and mobility systems. Lviv is, in the last 3 years, adopted its mobility plan and is committed to creating a city of short distances. So Orest, thank you so much for joining. We are very, very eager to hear from you and your experience, and I will just stop the screen sharing and I'll hand it off to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ivona. Hello, everybody. Hello, all participants. My name is Orest Oleksiv. Yeah, already mentioned. So I will show you a bit presentation about our city, about our difficult story. Let me show my screen. Yeah, looks like you can see it, right?
Yes.
I'm not sure if a lot of people know about our city, so I will start from a little introduction of the city. So our city is in Ukraine, western part of Ukraine, near Polish border. Ukraine used to be, maybe you know, part of Soviet Union for quite a long time. So we have become independent in 1991. This year we're celebrating 30 years of independence. Our city has a population of 730,000 people, but together with tourists and all people who are coming, also the students, our approximate population is around 1 million. Our area of the city is 182 square kilometers, and the density is around 4,000 people per square kilometer. So it's quite a dense city. Our city is quite old. It's more than 260 years old. And luckily, our city survived the Second World War too. It was not damaged like other cities in Europe, though we also had quite big battles near our city, but luckily our city survived. So we preserved our historical city structure that was developing since medieval times. That's why our city is also, our city center is a part of UNESCO World Heritage. But after our city has become part of Soviet Union after the Second World War, our city has started to develop outside the historical city as a typical Soviet city with modernist approach, wide streets, and typical residential high-rise buildings. This makes our mobility quite difficult and different. So if we look at our model split, if you, for example, compare 2019 and 2021, we see some trends that are happening in our city. So public transport is, usage of public transport is quite high in our city. It's, they say public transport is the backbone of our transport system. So around 50% of people use public transport. Car usage is around 1/4 of all journeys, so it's around 25%. If we look at the trends, we see that the number of car usage is rising every year. Right now, also I would like to mention that in 2019 we have done our mobility survey in the cold period in 2019, and in this year 2021 we done in warm time in June and May. That's why we can see some differences in the mobility patterns. Also, we can see that cycling in our city is around 5%, and it's constantly rising. For example, the first survey that was done in 2014, we had only 1.5% of people cycling. And other modes are not used that often. So I'll tell about our story of infrastructure transformation in the city. So quite a big influence in the transformation of our city started in 2012 when Lviv has become a host city of European Football Championship, and a lot of investments from the government went to our city to invest in infrastructure. So we had only like 3 years to improve our infrastructure, because after the collapse of Soviet Union, we had quite a big depression in whole Ukraine, and almost no streets were reconstructed for like 15 years. So in 2008, 2009, quite very big infrastructure projects were done in Lviv, and a lot of streets were mostly reconstructed very quickly. And the main objects of the reconstruction were just road for cars, while pedestrian sidewalks and, for example, public transport stops were not reconstructed. And close to the city center, most streets were just, most infrastructure was not improved. It was just done in the same dimensions as it was before, just renewed with new service. So such improvements were good. In our usage since the south, and a lot of people didn't like this trend. So we actually had a big rise of cycling initiatives in Lviv, and in 2010, first cycling movements have started to develop in our city. For example, this is a picture from one of first cycling movements, when cyclists gathered and draw a cycling lane in one of our main streets in the city. And this action was actually noticed by the city government, city administration, and one of the activists, Oleksiv, he was invited to become a mayor's advisor on cycling infrastructure. And he developed the first concept of cycling network development, and it was adopted in 2011. And since 2012, it was quite strongly like implemented year after year. So also in 2013, we managed to get a grant from German government to build first infrastructure, and in the first year we managed to build 13 kilometers of infrastructure, and like every year we built around 10 to 20 kilometers of new infrastructure. Though actually it was, as we look back from 2013, we see that our plans were actually very ambitious, because it was planned to build 260 kilometers of cycling infrastructure until 2020. But now we have only 120 kilometers of cycling infrastructure. So we built by now half of what was planned, but yet it's quite a big success for Ukraine and for our city, because we're constantly now leaders in building infrastructure for the city. So we now put the goals to finish our plans in the next 4 years. Another big movement, which was also grassroots initiatives, were initiatives for freeing the pedestrian space, because also, as I mentioned, in 2012 it has seen quite a big rise of car usage, and because our city is very dense, we have quite narrow historical streets. A lot of cars started to park on sidewalks. So the initiative of people was to free the sidewalks from the cars, and people gathered money to put bollards on the sidewalks. And this initiative was also quite adopted by the city. After this initiative, when 100 bollards were put by the people, our city started to put more and more bollards on the sidewalks to free them from cars. And also this initiative also stimulated our city to make legal paid parking on the streets as well. And in 2014, the city has made a new pedestrian area, which was in the part of UNESCO heritage zone, which used to be a medieval city surrounded by the walls. Before, cars can actually enter this area and park on the streets, but after the adoption of the pedestrian area, it has become a really attractive place for people to spend time, for tourists, and now people just cannot imagine this area with cars. But what also is significant about our pedestrian area is that trams can go through the pedestrian area, and it is accessible by the public transport. But at the same time, our big streets, major streets, were still reconstructed by the priorities and in the same way as they were done in Soviet times. The main reason was because we actually didn't have specialists that had the idea of new approaches of making streets more accessible for people, for businesses. And as you can see, previously streets were mostly reconstructed just for moving vehicles. There were not even spaces to park cars. Pedestrian crossings were in quite big distances between each other, so it was very inconvenient for people. Also, it was not sidewalks were quite narrow. They were not convenient for people that have some disabilities. But quite a big step and such influence, yes, it made people think differently, was the project Street for All, which was done in cooperation of Lviv City Council and the City Council of Leipzig City in Germany. When we've tried to use a German approach to city planning, to street planning, and took it as one example of the street. It's street Bandera Street, which is near the city center, close to one of the main universities of our city. And it has an important route for public transports, especially tram network. So after this project, it was this project lasted for 2 years, with involvement of different stakeholders. And the result of this project was actually a creation of a municipal design bureau for designing of streets and public spaces, which was called Institute for Spatial Development. One of the best specialists in the city in the in street design and infrastructure development were gathered in this municipal bureau. So one of their first street which was done was quite a small street, which was called Sadova Street. And it was the first example of the street that was reconstructed from one facade to another, not just the road, but the whole space of the city, which showed new approaches of sustainable mobility. Another very important project was our Lviv railway station. Ukraine has very good developed train network, and most tourists and mostly people travel to other cities in Ukraine using a railway. That's why railway is very important. But before, our railway square was very inconvenient. As you can see in the pictures, it was just parking. The bus stops were very inconvenient. They were not accessible, and it was actually complete chaos. So it was a project of the city to start the reconstruction of this area. And last year, the new project was done. Also, the aim of this project was to show the new priorities in transport development of the city. As you can see, it was divided into different zones. So, like the one zone was dedicated to public transport. The public transport stops were moved as close to the entrance as possible, while private cars were moved on the other side, on the left side, and also people could come by car close to the entrance, as well as take a taxi. And in front of the railway station was done a big pedestrian area, which is now very popular by everybody who come to the city or use the train. We also used like high accessible platforms for disabled people to enter the public vehicles. Also, the road to the main building of the railway station was also reconstructed using those priorities. It's the same year, in 2020, we've adopted our Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, which was developed for 2 years, quite a long time. We also involved a lot of stakeholders, as well as deputies and citizens in developing our main priorities and aims. So we actually choose seven main priorities of development, which include, of course, public transport, cycling, walking, as well as redirecting our car traffic from the city center. And as it was mentioned, building a city of short distances. Another big step in improving our infrastructure methods and priorities was adoption of municipal standards for street planning. It was developed by our specialists inside the city council, and it was adopted by our administration. So those standards, they include the standards of for the road safety, approaches, also road surface area, sidewalk, pedestrian zone, cycling infrastructure, standards for public transport stops, greening, and also stormwater management, because as we can see, we also can see quite a big influence of climate change. We suffer from quite heavy storms every summer, as well. The weather has become very unpredictable. Sometimes we have droughts, then we have big storms and heavy snowfall in winter. So it's very important to include those factors in your street design. And now we started to, now we can see some projects that were done by our city, municipal city bureau. One of the example is the Shevchenko Street, which was part of it was reconstructed last year, and this year another part is under reconstruction. It should be finished next year. It's one of the main streets of the city, which goes in the direction of Poland. So you can see this part close to the city center. It was redesigned to include space for everybody, for cars, public transport, cycling, walking, and businesses as well. So you can compare it to how the street was looked just a few years ago. You can see that it has become very different. Also, another important street which goes to Kiev direction, Bogdana Khmelnytskaya Street, it was also reconstructed, which included possibilities for all modes of transportation. You can compare it to how the street looked just a few years ago. It had no parking, and the area was not, and also no space for cyclists. And this year we finished also one part of the Bandera Street, which was the street which was done by this project of Street for All project. As you can see, the street has also changed quite significantly, because before it was also a street which had quite chaotic infrastructure, and now it's very different. It has space, big space for pedestrians, for businesses to develop, as well as convenient cycling infrastructure and spaces for cars to park. But we also do smaller projects as well. For example, those streets that were done for 2012 European Championship, we now reconstruct the area between the road and the facades. So one of the examples is on the other main road, where we planted trees and divided cycling infrastructure and pedestrians. Quite similar projects on another main street. Those projects now have stopped because also because of the COVID pandemic. Our budget has actually redirected, and we don't have that much money. So this year we're focusing mostly on some tactical measures to improve safety and public transport priorities. So we implement different measures for traffic calming. For example, we put pedestrian islands. We also try to separate car traffic from public transport, especially on tram lines, as well as improving, especially we put special focus on improving safety in residential streets, as well as special focus we do on streets which are close to schools and kindergartens. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm ready to talk with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Orest. This was really a really rich presentation, and I hope that for many of those that are watching, this was very insightful. So please add your questions to Q&A chat or Q&A box, which is on the left. And let me begin here with a question about the early, like the beginnings during the civil movements, which was also my question. So May is asking here, I'm intrigued by both the role of civil society in pushing for change and then the government's response to it. Can you talk a little bit more about this relationship and how it is today? And to add to that, also, I was wondering about, you know, how fast was the response of the government, and what exactly was that response in 2010 with regards to the public movements?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually our mayor, which is now it's his fourth term, yeah, so he is now a mayor for 15 years. And actually his approach is that if somebody is very active and this person has some ideas, he is inviting this person to work for the city council. So actually, Oleksiv is the one that has become the mayor advisor, was invited this way. I am personally also can be also named as such person, yeah, which was I also was one of the part of this grassroots, the one which was fighting for a pedestrian zone, which was called Dайте пройти, as it's mentioned, allow me to pass, to pass through. But also at the same time, we managed to gather this team of people which wants to improve, really wants to improve our street infrastructure, our city to become more sustainable and more safe for pedestrians. But at the same time, we have another group of people, they're mostly car drivers, which now see our successes, and they are very unhappy with what is happening in the city. So they also form their own grassroots, and they try to move our city in the direction of car-oriented development. So it's not so maybe if you look at the presentation, it's not so very easy for us to implement all those measures, because every new measure it's always very big discussions with public, with deputies, and also even inside the city council. Some of my colleagues they're not often sometimes they are trying to put some car-oriented decisions, but now we're managing to actually walk in the right direction and to implement our sustainable mobility plan.
Gotcha. I'll pick up a question, that two related questions about data gathering prior to implementing cycling lanes. So there's a question here from Shashidara and Ziliang. So basically the question is, was there any specific study or studies done to understand cycling patterns and cycle lane utilization? And Ziliang is asking, could you explain the method of gathering of data basically, and how often this is done?
So actually, when it was in 2010, when the first cycling network was developed, so there was not so much data available. So mostly how it was done is just actually it was gathered a group of specialists, as well as cyclists were involved, which developed this scheme, But now we are starting to develop a new cycling concept, and we now have more opportunities and more available data for planning of the routes. So we use, for example, we also have in the city a transport model, which is done by also our municipal company. So it also has an instrument which allows to plan cycling routes. Also, we gather data from our network, seller network. We pay money for them, and they give us the data of how people move from A to B. But we also, regarding the second question, big amount of data we have from our survey of mobility. It's actually sociological survey, which was developed by our specialists, and it's quite a big survey. It has around 60 questions. It depends on how people answer, so from 60 to 80 questions, and those questions regard how they move, what kind of transport they use, and and how they move using different modes of transport and for different purposes. And it allows us to make the understanding and the pattern main movements in the city. So our model split is just one part of this, the result of this survey. We can also analyze, for example, how people can move, how people move, for example, from home to work, or how they move for leisure, or how they move, for example, to school. And we can also analyze whether they use different modes of transport for different purposes. And regarding how often we do this survey, so before we did this survey every 2 years. Actually we did this before every 3 years. Now we do this every 2 years. So this year we also plan to do another survey for the cold period of time. So now we will have also data from this year, from cold year, and from the cold period and from the warm period. And in 2 years, we'll also do this survey, and so we can compare how our mobility patterns are changing.
Got it. So let me continue with this thread of cycle lanes. There are a few related questions. There's another one here from MA about when you mentioned the initial cycling plan. Basically, you mentioned that the goals of the cycle kilometers were not met. So she's wondering, why do you think this was the case? Was there the target too ambitious, or maybe the priorities or the focus has changed to any of the other activities that the city was leading?
So it's a good question. Actually, when we started to develop our new concept and improve our cycling scheme, we analyzed why those goals were not reached, and there are quite a few reasons. So first reason was actually that most of this, and I think the biggest success of this scheme was that when some street was reconstructed, so it was always, for example, the department that was reconstructing the street, they looked at the map and checked whether there should be cycling infrastructure or not. So if the street was in part of cycling route, so they built on the street cycling infrastructure. Of course, then it was quite largely criticized by different opponents, because they said that our cycle network starts from nowhere and ends nowhere. But now we can see that those different parts of cycle networks, they are being, so we do a separate project to connect them, and we now have seamless routes in different directions, quite most of the directions, yeah. But of course, another reason is that it was not the main priority for the city, and especially for the deputies, because in our legislation, deputies, they play a big role in deciding how the budget should be spent. So they allocate money in their favor quite often. So they have such possibilities. So even if the city proposes some projects, they can sometimes not give money for them, but give to another one that they think is better.
So let me pick up a question about impacts of the pandemic on sustainable transportation. So there's a second question from Ziliang here, that the contribution rate of cycling dropped in 2021. Do you think that the reason of it is that the cycling still lacks bicycle facilities? Would it be improved after COVID, or improved after COVID, or further construction will be made? And similar question here again is about basically impacts of the pandemic on the sustainable transport at large. Any new trend?
Actually, if regarding the results of the survey, because of its sociological survey, it has around 2.5% like difference. Yeah, so so the result can be different in 2.5% in both directions. So we also do another survey. We count cyclists on some main routes, and the countings show that actually the number of cyclists is rising in our city. So comparing those two surveys, the results, we can now estimate that it's around that our model split for cycling is around 5%, and comparing to 2019, it has risen in around 1%. Also for a rising number of people on two wheels, I would say, is the big popularity of electric scooters, because in recent years, electric scooters has become very popular among young people. And we also now have a lot of free electric scooter services that allow for people to rent them and use for transportation. That's why there's a boom now in the usage of cycling network. So if we compare it, for example, what is the influence of the COVID pandemic, we're actually quite afraid about how it will influence public transport usage. Actually, in the hard times of pandemic, when we had strict quarantine, of course, the usage of public transport had dropped significantly. But now, when we see that when the quarantine has become not so strict, and now all the restrictions for public transport are not valid, we can see that public transport has now again become very popular. A lot of people now use public transport. We see that we now need to put more rolling stock for on the routes. So actually, public transport is becoming again popular. But also, what was a drawback of the pandemic was that a lot of people actually bought cars in this period, especially people that live outside the city, in the suburbs, because in the quarantine time, the suburb buses, which are not operated by the city but operated by the regional administration, a lot of routes were not working. So the only way for people to get to the city was actually a car. So people cooperated, they used their neighbors' cars, and it actually influenced a lot of people to buy cars. Also, we can see it by the statistics from the police. In 2020, we have the rise of 20% in buying cars. But at the same time, as I mentioned, more people started to use bicycles also in this period. Our surveys show that we have the rise of people who own bicycles. It's also around 20% since 2019.
Right there, you answered partially my next question, but I wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit about this concept of city of short distances. We have similar terms like the 15-minute neighborhoods or complete neighborhoods. So I wanted to plug in a question here about experience of Lviv and the way it tackles sprawl. As we know, many cities are experiencing sprawl, including in Eastern Europe. So I am curious about the way the public transport connectivity and network continuity is being coordinating within Lviv jurisdiction and beyond. And you mentioned the metropolitan or regional governance. And so basically, how is the transportation system being coordinated, And on top of that, how it is also integrated with land use to create this the city of short distances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's now a big goal for the city. Now we, for example, our institution transport office is now working quite closely with spatial development and an architectural office. The architectural office, they developed integrated spatial development of the city. It's now changes the approach how the city should develop in spatial way, because we still now have the master plan, which is still valid until 2025. And this master plan, it still uses old Soviet approaches of extensive development of the city. So it actually this master plan allows the city to grow outside, to grow more and build new districts on 3 areas outside the city. But our new integrated approach of city development, it's now switching this approach and to using the lands which are not used very efficient inside the existing city borders, city limits. Actually, after the Soviet Union, we have a lot of factories that have stopped working, and now the land is not used very efficiently. So the plan is actually to use priorities to use those land for development and not use land outside the city, the existing city limits. As well, we have quite big areas for the military, because in Soviet times, the western border was, in the time of Cold War, it was very important for Soviet Union. That's why we have big areas of military, which is now moving to the east borders of Ukraine. That's why we have new free area for development, and it's also a priority to connect new public transport routes when the development is being planned. But if you regard our connection with other residential areas outside the city, so we have sometimes we have success, sometimes we have some problems. Sometimes our negotiation with our administration, regional administration, is quite difficult, especially regarding the connection with public transport routes, because there are quite some big business influence regarding public transport connection. So it's quite difficult to connect our plans with the plans of administration. But a good step which is now happening is administrative reform. And now we have villages that are close to the city. They are now being connected to the agglomeration, which is now controlled by our city government, and it allows us to plan mobility and the development of those villages in coordination with the development of the city.
So to follow up on that, I'm just curious if there were any private or informal transport services that were operating in the past, or have been or are operating now and were formalized to service those villages and towns that are more on the periphery.
So let me understand. Are you asking about private companies which operate bus routes, or what
yeah,
do you mean?
like smaller vehicles, like the mini buses and whatnot. There were in the past. I'm sure there was this, emergence of those and how they were basically approached by the city.
Yeah, so actually, if we talk about those routes which go to the villages, they're mostly operated by private companies which use minibuses, so it's quite a big problem for our city. We also still have some of those routes in the city, though they're mostly switched to middle-sized buses. But since 2010, we introduced municipal buses, and we now operate around 250 big buses. And we have left around 180 smaller buses. So it's actually a reform which is happening for the last 5 years. And we buy new rolling stock like every 2 years and replace them the smaller buses with big buses.
Great. So we still have about 9 minutes. So let me pick up a couple of questions here about financing. So there's one from Andrew, for example, about financing streams for sustainable mobility systems. And then a related question, how does the budgeting process relate to the sustainable mobility plan?
Yeah, so actually our budgeting process is always a very difficult process. First of all, our administration, they form proposals of how the budget should be relocated and used. So now we actually check with the Sustainable Mobility Plan how the projects are implemented and what projects we should put to the next budget year. So in our city, we plan budget every year. And now we're starting, for example, in September, we're starting the budgeting process. So we're now gathering all the ideas for the projects. And then we give proposals to our deputies. But after that, deputies can actually decide to what projects they give money and to what projects they don't give. Yeah, so they can allocate the money. And then it's put to the city council, which adopts this budget. Of course, the drawback of such system is that actually citizens cannot influence very much on how the budget is being relocated. Of course, they can do it every 5 years when they vote for deputies. But we also have another instrument, which is called public budget, which is every year people can vote for some projects that the city budget will be done by the city budget.
Got it. And right there, you answered my next question about public participation. But also going on that line, there are usually few questions related to public pushbacks, specifically the car drivers, especially in the early stage of implementing the sustainable transport routes and modes, and basically taking away space from cars and allocating it to those sustainable modes. So were there specific city tactics or approaches, like communication approaches that the city used to basically alleviate those, maybe angry drivers or the sentiment at that time?
Yes, actually, this communication is now a very big part of our work, and luckily we have quite a big number of supporters. And what we see a trend in a few years now is that in our city developed a few video bloggers which actually do video blogs on sustainable mobility and in promoting sustainable mobility and explaining what approaches should be done. So they actually help us in our work, as well as they also give another view for people who are not don't have any like strict opinion. If you talk about car drivers, they're mostly very loud, but if you look at the statistics, they are not the majority of the city citizens. They also developed quite a strong group, which is active online, as well as they do sometimes different demonstrations. Of course, they are involved also in different discussions regarding street design. And sometimes we also take some of their ideas and use them in the finished design. But of course, what we actually do is try to communicate with people who are concerned and try to answer most of the questions which are put. For example, people sometimes are concerned why there's less space for cars, or often there are a lot of discussions which may sound quite quite hard to understand. It's about, for example, why we have to explain why we have to put traffic lights on some crossings in some intersections, or why we use some approaches of traffic calming. So actually, most of our things we have to explain, but I think the best promotion of our ideas will be the streets that were constructed this and the last year. So when people will really start to use them, they will feel the difference. And I think that the personal experience will be actually the best promotion of the ideas which are in Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. And that's in this way we'll have more supporters in the public.
I agree that process takes time, and basically getting that buy-in also takes time. So related to the car drivers again, a question here about parking from Parin. Parin is asking, how did you manage parking? Were there any challenges, and how did you overcome them? And I'll just add whether there were also parking studies done.
Yes, so actually our parking project started from the study which was done by our university. So they developed the plan where should the first parking spaces should be done. In the beginning, when the first parking spaces were made, they were not very successful because our legislation didn't allow. It was very difficult to punish drivers that didn't pay for parking. But now, since 2018, we now have an ability to have municipal inspectors that can put fines on people who don't pay for parking, and it's now helping to work for those parking spaces efficiently. Because before, a lot of people, some people which were more, actually we had around 20% of people who paid for parking. Now we have around 60% of people who are paying for parking, but we still take more and more inspectors which work in the city, and now people understand that they have to pay. Of course, it makes us other challenges because those drivers are looking for places for free parking. Sometimes they can park on sidewalks, but we also put fines on those drivers and or put bollards depending on the situation.
Great. So I'm just going to ask the final question, a little bit more general, before we end this session. And these answers have been really great. Thank you, Orest. So the closing question is, what advice would you give to cities looking to improve sustainable mobility? What was the biggest challenge in developing the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan now with implementing it?
Yeah, so my advice would be to gather a good team to find people who are motivated and have a vision. I think it's the most important. If you have support, if you have people who have this drive for change, you can do a lot. And also it's very good to find some additional support if you cannot find it inside. I mean, financial support. You can also look outside. There are a lot of funds and other programs that can help you to implement your ideas and your big and improve your city.
Got it. Well, so this was the final question. We're approaching the end of the session. Orest, this was really wonderful, very rich Q&A. Thank you so much for your time. But first and foremost, thank you for everyone who tuned in today. Let me just give you a few updates. You'll be able to retrieve the webinar presentation and view the recording in the next 2 days. Please follow us on social media and stay informed about the forthcoming online events, which are very exciting for the next few months, and also exciting releases. And do check our Transport Matters blog series. Additionally, I wanted to make a quick plug-in here about our upcoming webinar. I would like to invite you to the webinar on September 28th. It's a part 1 of the 2 roundtables focusing on parking reform in US cities, which will bring together policymakers and experts discussing approaches to managing parking space. We'll announce the webinar even soon on our website where you can register for it. So with that, thank you again. Thank you, Orest. Thank you, attendees. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Oh, Orest, you're on mute.
Sorry. I was also wanted to thank everybody and thank you, Ivona, and hopefully meet somewhere in some other events.
Agreed. Thank you so much, and hopefully in person. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.